So we're going to have a great discussion. We've had a number of panels that I've at least personally enjoyed on digital infrastructure over the last couple of days. This panel promises to go beyond telecom to really drill down into the architecture for evolving services using digital infrastructure. And of course, some of those strategies must relate to cybersecurity, on which Dr. Motohiro is an expert. I'm just going to pause one moment while we do have somebody not feeling well. Do we have okay, very good. Okay, so on digital infrastructure, Meta, obviously, as we learned yesterday, is one of the owner and operators of the largest group of digital assets across the whole digital asset class. So I think you can start off kind of with describing what are Meta's plans to evolve the architecture for the next generation of services.
Thank you, Tricia. And again, as I said yesterday, it's great to be here. It's great that we're all back together in person, full bore here at PTC. So, yesterday, Gaia started talking about the kinds of things that we see, right? I remember going way back to, my first PTC, right? And it was about networks for voice. And how do we connect, networks for voice across the Pacific? And boy, we've come a long way. And, the last 3 days we've heard about, end-to-end. And we've talked about, the importance of the internet and broadband. And we've really moved now from just telecom and networks, right? PTC was about telecom, right? No longer, right? It's the end-to-end. It's from the data center, whether it's public cloud, or in the case of Meta, our DCs we just use them for our own data. So they're essentially private data centers. And then there's the networks, and it's all the way to the devices. And it's all for us, and I think more generally, it's what we were hearing, it's about the user experience. And that user can be an individual, the user can be an enterprise, or any other large organization. And as a result, when you're thinking about user experience, we've moved from, minutes of voice way, way back. But then it was like narrowband data, text, and then photographs, then video, a lot of video, and two-way video. And now we're moving into VR, right? Virtual reality, AR, augmented reality, then mixed reality, XR. And that's a journey that we are very much obviously involved in. We call it the metaverse. But we're looking at something that's out in the future. And we think about that infrastructure in order to be able to provide that quality of experience. And this is and there was a session, I think, earlier today on all about edge. And we really hadn't talked that much here about edge. But edge is the new, I think, buzzword, but it's actually more than a buzzword. It's really, really important. And so, when we think about it, the kinds of investments that we're making and really this change and the shift in the architecture, yes, we absolutely need subsea, so to connect our data centers. So we have data centers in the US and in Europe, and there's one that's under construction, will soon be turned on in Singapore. That's it. Because we're not a public cloud company, we do not have data centers distributed around the world. So we need networks, really robust, big networks. So that's where we're building subsea systems to connect those data centers. And then for the user experience, improvements, significant improvements in edge investments. And that, in our mind, is, we're seeing a shift, and that's from CPU to GPU, and we're seeing some of the things that we've innovated in and now others are doing as well, carrier neutral co-location sites. So we call those CNCs. And those CNCs are really essential because you're going to need to be moving your points of presence further out into the network closer to the users, and you're going to be putting compute in those POPs in order to improve that user experience. And so we're also seeing the growth of CDNs. We're seeing, and for a long time now, we've been building out, or we've been funding and paying for caching globally. So, we have, caches in terms of our caching in over 200 countries and territories, with over 2,000 local internet service providers. We're in over 1,000 metros with caching. Right? Now, that's not going to disappear, but that's for static content. The videos, the reels, the video that you see on Instagram. But when you're doing dynamic, right, when you're moving into AR, VR, mixed reality, the other is static, right? We're moving into dynamic, right? You've got the static for caching, but now we're going to need to have more processing at the edge, and we're paying for that, right? So we're making those investments. So those are the types of major shifts in the infrastructure architecture, the investments, where those investments are being made, and the reasons for making them. And in terms of the points of presence, we have over 100 around the world. And what's interesting is the plurality of those are in Europe. And in fact, Europe has more than twice as many POPs as any of the other regions, which is, again, real investment in network, or in the networks, and in improving the quality of experience globally.
All right, well, thank you for that overview. I'm sure the audience appreciates that. You mentioned subsea cables, and I know that's an area where Motohiro has focused on in terms of some of the cybersecurity policies. But because from a policy perspective, and I'm a regulatory lawyer, so I come at many of these issues, at least for my clients, through the policy angle. One of the best ways to have innovation and evolving digital infrastructure is a competitive market. So could you give the audience a bit of an overview of the Japanese subsea market? Japan has always been a leader in some of the technologies and innovating them. Could you give us, an overview of the market?
All right, thank you, Tsuchiya. So I'm Motohiro Tsuchiya, a professor at Keio University in Japan. I'm a political scientist of international relations, focusing on cybersecurity these days. But I'm also interested in submarine cables more than a quarter century. So I look younger, but I'm not young at all, actually. And so I know Bob more than 20 years. He hasn't changed for the 20 years.
That's true.
So he's always same. But Japan is an island country, and like Hawaii. And so in Japan's case, our international traffic depends on undersea cables 99%. It's only 1% is going through satellites. And we have 15 or more cable landing stations all over Japan. But only 2 places are concentrated, big places, wider Tokyo area, and so greater Tokyo area, greater Osaka areas. So as most of you know, the cable industry is layered. So some companies are manufacturing cables themselves, and so systems. And so some other companies are laying cables at the bottom of the sea. And so other companies are assembling systems. And the other companies are operating communication systems through undersea cables. So they are different perspectives. But there are 3 companies in the world, maybe 4 companies in the world to produce cables. So one is the Subcom from the US, and the ASN, Alcatel Submarine Networks from Europe, and NEC is producing a lot of cables in the world. So these 3 companies are occupying more than 90% of the cables. But Chinese company, Huawei Marine Network Technologies, is coming into the market. So they are building a lot of cable systems in Middle East and Africa these days. And but I believe the most important part is dry plant inside the cable landing stations. So as I'm a political scientist and I'm a member of the government council in Japan to advise about the geo-economic factors, geo-economic risks these days. So we're worrying about systems inside the cable landing stations where we have wavelength terminal equipment and so line terminal equipment and other machines are installed. Manufacturers of those equipment includes NEC, Mitsubishi, and Fujitsu from Japan, and Sienna, Xtella, Infinera from the US, ASN and Nokia from Europe. Of course, HM Tech is from China. I say they are doing best, but from my perspective, so from the perspective of political scientists, so they can be a target of supply chain attacks. So there are a lot of supply chain risks reported. So servers used by Apple or Amazon Web Services were hacked. So they are containing tiny, tiny chips inside. And those chips are sending signals to unidentified servers in other countries. That kind of thing might happen in cable landing stations these days. So many of digital bits are encrypted. So it might be difficult to decrypt or break those codes. I know, but intelligence agencies or government, enemy governments are trying to understand who is sending email, other messages to whom. So if I send something to Bob every day, what they are planning to do, maybe beer in a bar, or maybe kind of terrorist attack against the US government. We don't know because the message is encrypted. But the enemies or US government or Japanese government can identify they are communicating. So if we tap something inside the cable landing station, that kind of thing is happening. So I'm worrying about it. So what is next generation digital services? If I knew it, I would resign from the university and I will start a new company, but so I have no knowledge about it. But so we have to have very secure communication systems in the future. So internet was open, so we discussed it with Bob for many, many times at the FCC or in Tokyo. So freedom of sending bits to everybody, so connect everyone in the world. It's a good goal from my perspective as a political scientist of the international relations. But at the same time, we have to think about security. So how we can secure cables, secure systems, and secure communications. So if we can do that, we can have a better future. So I don't know what will happen next 5 years, next 10 years, but I believe security is still a big factor in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And we heard from the Deputy Director of Cybersecurity at your ministry yesterday that Japan does have a national cybersecurity strategy, and you may have worked on it for all we know, but that's certainly important. And we heard from a US panelist yesterday as well. The US is getting one together. We're supposed to issue it sometime later today. That's a fascinating point, Motohiro, that 99% of Japan's international traffic is by subsea cables. 90% of global internet traffic is over subsea at some point, right? So it's security of those cables is a shared, I think, imperative for all of us, right? We do have microphones in both aisles, so if anybody wants to ask a question, feel free to get in line, and time permitting, we will get to you. But of course, Meta, as you noted, operates and owns a number of cables and partners in some. But what is Meta's strategy for securing its cables, either physically or cybersecurity?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. In fact, even before we started building cables, our approach is assuming that we are in a zero trust world, right? So we build for security. It doesn't make a difference where that is. So, for example, we helped develop with partners what we call an open cable. And basically what that means is that instead of sharing lambdas, instead of sharing frequencies, instead of spectrum sharing, each of the consortium members have their own fiber pairs, right? And at the cable landing station with the SLTs, with the equipment, we have our own equipment. And everything is encrypted end to end. I mean, and again, it's precisely for these reasons. And supply chain security is extremely important, so that you need to know the equipment and be able to trust it that you're putting into these networks, right? And then that's something that we focus on. And we do that even, the end-to-end encryption, the fiber pairs on our terrestrial networks in the United States. So again, it's, we assume zero trust. Right. And we build to that because if you don't have, security, you don't have a network, you don't have business, right? And this is also, so the incentives for building that in are really strong. The other thing in terms of the strategies and for the global networks is diversity of routing and diversity of cable landing stations. You can't have diversity of cables all landing in one station.
Right.
Right. You could have a natural disaster that wipes out that cable landing station. Right. We've seen that, or an underwater volcano, or a fishing boat that cuts a cable, but you need diversity of routing, diversity of cable landing stations, and you need the ability to control your pairs, right, and on the end to end. Right.
And Motohiro hopefully explain how diverse and competitive the SLTE market is, and it's a global market, so that's helpful. The open cables model, is that being taken up in Japan? Is that widely deployed in some of the Japanese cables?
To be honest, I have no knowledge about the open cable system, but so we are discussing that open up the cable landing stations accessibility. So Japan is in a very critical point, so location. So from the west coast of the United States to Asia, so we are in a critical point. So everyone wants to access the cable landing station in Japan. But so those stations are controlled by carriers, NTT or maybe KDDI, SoftBank, and other operators, maybe foreign operators too. But they are exclusively operated by cable owners only. But from my perspective, so I'm still worrying about the security. So again, one day I visited a cable landing station in the countryside. So in Japan, so everybody looks same, right? So it's difficult to distinguish the Koreans, Japanese, and the Chinese, but almost same. But one day in the cable landing station, I identified a foreigner. It's a countryside, so it's quite easy to identify a foreigner. So because he looked like an Indian. So I asked him, who is that guy? So the operator at the cable landing station, oh, he's from Google. Okay, why he's there? Because he's the owner of the cable. Wow. So, of course, he must be a good guy. But so how we can trust him or her? So it's quite difficult to manage the facilities. So maybe I'm thinking too much, I'm worrying too much. But so that kind of physical security is also becoming issue here in Japan, not here, sorry, in Japan. So I was a government advisor to draft the cybersecurity strategy, first to cybersecurity strategy. So 10 years ago, people didn't care about the physical security of cables. And 10 years ago, I made a presentation that it's easy to identify the location of cable landing station. It's open source information. And so I always try to identify if I go to a foreign country, in the US, Singapore, and in England, and in Taiwan. I never did it in China, but so I try to identify cable landing station. It's quite easy. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I can find a manhole on the beach. Maybe I can open up and throw a bomb. If I try to cut it by myself, so I would be die, so it's a high voltage electricity. But so it might be easier for terrorists. I can identify the location. So that kind of thing must be consideration in the Japanese government these days. So last month, the Japanese government made a new national security strategy, national defense strategy, national defense build-up plan. So we call it the defense 3 documents. Those documents are not touching upon cable, but they say so we have to protect national infrastructures. How we can do it? It's purely owned by commercial companies, not owned by the government. How we can protect it? We are thinking about it, but we don't have a good solution yet. So we are dependent on you. We are dependent on ICTs. Our lives are dependent on cables because we are an island country. US is also a big island. So you are dependent on Atlantic cable and the Pacific cables. Australia, they are worrying about the cable cut. We have many evidences in the past. World War I, so British cut German cables. World War II, a lot of cable landing stations were lost in the Pacific area. And so several years ago, the Egyptian government arrested 3 guys trying to cut the cable at the bottom of the sea. So Hawaii cable was a target of cyber attacks last year. So Star Advertiser, local newspaper, reported it. So we have to think about it. So how we can merge business ideas and security ideas.
Well, and Bob can certainly attest to the U.S. government's role in, at least on the front end of licensing, where a network security agreement must be negotiated, which includes physical requirements to access the cable landing station and some other promises on the cybersecurity side. Is the ministry considering that in Japan? It's one thing to have a plan, right? And I'm not promoting more regulation, although it's good for lawyers. But is the ministry considering more affirmative requirements from the cable operators on security?
So Prime Minister Kishida, current Prime Minister, is trying to have diversified the routes of cables. And he wants to have more cable landing station in countryside. Mm-hmm. So it might generate the local economies. So Japan is shrinking day by day. So our population is decreasing these days. We have more active economies in the countryside. So he wants to try to mix those policies. And of course, security is another idea. And I went to Taiwan, Taipei, last month. And so we discussed possible cable problems. And if I were a Chinese PLA officer, I would destroy cables. All the cables connected to Taiwan, except one connected to the mainland China. So China might manipulate the information and data in Taiwan. It's happening already in Ukraine. So in 2014, the Crimea was merged by Russia in a, I don't know.
2014.
Yeah, 2014. So they merged the Crimea. And 2 months after the merger, so Kerch Strait cable was built, just 46 kilometers. They are connecting Crimea and Russia. So Crimea is disconnected to continental Ukraine. So Russia is manipulating information in Crimea. So that kind of thing might happen and is happening in the world. So we are worrying about it. Japan is worrying about it. And I hope the Hawaiian government is thinking about it. So maybe I'm wrong.
But it's certainly good to be, aware of the threats. Now, again, Bob, you are active in policy circles even beyond the U.S. I know you advise the U.K. regulator. And is there a forum where the U.S. and Japan and perhaps others are discussing security of digital infrastructure broadly, maybe including
Well, digital infrastructure broadly. I mean, I don't know of a forum on specifically the subsea, but for example, the Quad and the Quad meetings where it's U.S., Japan, India, and Australia. And I thought it was very instructive as we were discussing that even the minister from Japan was referring to the Indo-Pacific region. And I think that there's an emerging new alignment of interests. I would agree. I mean, physical security. Most of the cable cuts are not about attacks or, bad
fishing
actors.
Boats, right?
It's fishing boats. It's underwater volcanoes. It's mudslides and things like that. And the old, Andy Grove. Just because you're paranoid doesn't mean you're wrong. Or nobody's. It helps to worry about these things, which is what we do. That's why we are assuming, right, a sort of a zero trust environment. Nothing is safe, and so you build in physical security. And you make sure that the people who have access to the cable landing station, right, are trusted.
Even if they're from Google. Okay.
Even if they're from Google.
Yes.
So these are all things definitely to worry about, but you can't let that prevent the investment or the benefits. And the other thing is, what you also want is once you get to the landing station, you want it to be an open landing station so that you actually have competition on the terrestrial side as well. But in Japan, you have your domestic carriers, right? They are trusted by government because they're vetted by government. And so you don't want to not have the benefits of the investment and the competition, but you absolutely have to worry about security of the infrastructure. And hopefully we never have to actually see or worry about, the worst case that you're describing. But it's not irrational to worry about it. But I think what you have to do is be careful not to have that prevent investments, upgrades, and by the way, new routes, right? We just last month applied for a new cable called Bifrost from the U.S. to Indonesia onto Singapore, right? And that completely bypasses South China Sea.
And so it was for route diversity as well as additional traffic?
Absolutely, it's for route diversity, right? And those are the things that you look for.
Okay.
Yeah, Bob is always stable and so neutral and fair, but I'm always pessimistic. So negative thinking is human nature, I think, but so I'm worrying too much, maybe. But I know that you are improving the world, so we are getting more convenient tools and services from the ICT industry. So we are living in a better world compared with 50 years ago. Yeah. So we want to be optimistic, but we should not forget the security side. So that's my message.
That's perfect. So we have the yin and the yang. Now we've run out of time.
Or the trust but verify.
And the trust but verify, yes. So please join me in thanking this perfectly balanced panel.